The plane had been in the air for less than 40 minutes when the flight attendant caught the eye of her colleague near the galley and gave her a look that needed no words. It was the kind of look that passes between people who work long hours in close quarters and have developed a shorthand for every situation that a cabin full of strangers can produce. And what this particular look said was that the young woman in seat 2A was not doing well and was not getting better, and neither of them quite knew what to do about it. The flight from New York to London was 11 hours long on a good day, and it had barely started, and the young woman had been crying since before the boarding doors closed. Not the quiet kind of crying that people sometimes do on planes when the combination of altitude and dim lighting and the particular loneliness of being suspended between one place and another loosens something they have been keeping together through sheer force of daily routine. This was different. This was the kind of crying that has weight to it, that fills the space around a person, that makes the air feel different in a way that the people nearby can feel, even if they are pretending not to notice. And in first class, where the seats were wide and the lighting was soft, and the general agreement among passengers was that everyone's privacy was everyone else's most important courtesy. Pretending not to notice was something people were very practiced at. The man across the aisle had his headphones in before they reached cruising altitude. The couple 2 rows back had angled themselves toward each other in a way that neatly excluded everything beyond their small shared space. The older gentleman in the window seat at the front had his eye mask on and his blanket pulled up and had made his position on the matter perfectly clear without saying a single word. The young woman in seat 2A was 26 years old, and her name was Vivian. And she was the only daughter of one of the most recognized names in American finance, a man whose face had appeared on the covers of enough business publications that most people in first class would have known it immediately if they had seen it, and whose daughter had been raised in the particular kind of life that comes with that level of wealth and recognition, private schools, and summer houses and a calendar that was managed by other people and a public image that was always supposed to be composed. Vivian was not composed. She had her face turned toward the window, and her shoulders were pulled in, and her whole body had the posture of someone trying to take up as little space as possible, which was the one thing about her that reminded you she was still a person underneath everything else. Still someone who had learned at some point that her feelings were an inconvenience to the spaces she moved through and had internalized that lesson so deeply that even now, even in the middle of whatever this was, she was trying to make it smaller than it was. She was not succeeding. Her hands were in her lap, and she had twisted the strap of the small bag she'd brought on board into a tight coil, and then uncoiled it and then coiled it again. And the tissues on the tray table in front of her had been there since somewhere over the eastern seaboard, and there were several of them now, crumpled and set aside with a care that seemed almost automatic, the tiding instinct running even when everything else was not. The flight attendant had come to her twice already. The first time with water and a warm towel and that gentle professional tone that is specifically designed to offer comfort without requiring the passenger to explain themselves, which Vivian had received with a polite thank you and a brief attempt at composure that lasted until the flight attendant was about 4 steps away. The second time with a small menu and a quiet inquiry about whether she could bring anything at all, and Vivian had shaken her head and said she was fine, which was so obviously untrue that the flight attendant had to do something specific with her own face to keep it neutral as she walked back to the galley and exchanged that look with her colleague. 4 rows back from seat 2A in seat 4C, a woman named Claudette had been watching all of this unfold since boarding. She was 44 years old, and she had the kind of face that people trusted on sight, without being able to explain exactly why, warm and direct, and not given to performance of any kind. She had grown up in Baltimore, raised 3 children on her own after her marriage ended when her youngest was barely 2. And she had spent the last 19 years working as a cafeteria supervisor at a public school where every day required her to manage chaos and emotion and hunger, literal and otherwise, with limited resources and genuine care. She was not a wealthy woman. The seat she was sitting in had been an upgrade she had worked toward for 2 years, collecting points with a discipline that her children found both admirable and slightly obsessive, saving them for this specific trip to visit her sister in London, a trip she had been promising herself since before her youngest started high school. This was the first time in 12 years she had traveled anywhere for herself, just herself, with no one to pack for and no one to check on and no schedule that belonged to anyone but her. And she had boarded that plane with a quiet, private happiness that she had not wanted to make a big deal of, because she was not the kind of woman who made a big deal of things. But that was real and deep and entirely hers. She had noticed Vivian before they even boarded, at the gate, standing slightly apart from the other first-class passengers with her bag against her chest and her eyes doing something complicated that Claudette recognized immediately, because she had seen it in her own mirror on the mornings after the nights that had been too much. It was the look of someone who had been holding something for a very long time and was beginning to feel the full weight of it in a new and frightening way. On the plane, Claudette had watched the flight attendants do their careful professional best and come up short through no fault of their own, because what was happening in that seat was not a problem that warm towels and professional kindness were built to reach. She had watched the other passengers arrange themselves into their various forms of deliberate non-involvement, and she had understood it because she was not naive about the complicated arithmetic of intervening in a stranger's grief in a confined space where everyone has to keep living in proximity for the next 10.5 hours. She had turned it over in her mind the way she turned things over when she was deciding something, methodically and without rushing herself. And she had thought about her own daughter, who was 23, and she had thought about what she would want for her daughter if she were the one sitting in that seat in that state with 11 hours of ocean beneath her and not one person in the cabin willing to cross the invisible line that everyone had agreed to maintain. And when she thought about it that way, the decision was not complicated at all. It was actually very simple. She reached up and pressed the button to turn off her reading light, and she tucked her book into the seat pocket, and she unfastened her seatbelt, and she stood up. And she walked forward through the quiet cabin towards seat 2A. And she did not rehearse what she was going to say, because she had learned a long time ago that the most important things could not be rehearsed, that they had to come from the place in you that already knew what was needed and was just waiting for you to get out of your own way and let it speak. She reached the row, and she stopped, and she crouched down in the aisle so that she was level with the young woman rather than standing over her. And she waited for a moment until Vivian felt the presence beside her and turned from the window. Their eyes met, and Claudette said, quietly and without any preamble, "I can see you're going through something, and I'm not going to pretend I don't." She said she wasn't there to pry, and she would go straight back to her seat if that was what was wanted. But she said she had children of her own, and she had been sitting back there watching for a while, and she just couldn't keep sitting there doing nothing. She said sometimes a person just needs somebody to acknowledge that what they're carrying is real. Vivian looked at her for a long moment. This stranger, crouching in the aisle of a transatlantic flight, with no agenda visible in her face except simple human concern. And something behind her eyes shifted in a way that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with the relief of being truly seen. She didn't say anything at first. She just nodded, and Claudette settled into the empty seat beside her, and the cabin continued its quiet hum around them. And outside the window, the Atlantic stretched out dark and vast and indifferent below. And inside that one small pocket of the plane, something that had been locked opened just slightly. The way things open when the right person arrives. At the right moment with nothing to offer except their full and unhurried presence. Claudette had not planned to spend her first solo transatlantic flight sitting in someone else's seat holding space for a stranger's grief. She had planned to read the novel she had been carrying around for 3 months without finding the time to open it, and to eat whatever the airline brought her without feeling guilty about it, and to watch at least 2 films back to back the way she never got to do at home, and to arrive in London feeling like a woman who had done something entirely for herself for the first time in longer than she cared to count. None of that was happening now, and she was completely at peace with that, because the moment she had crouched down in that aisle and looked into that young woman's face she had known, with the kind of knowing that bypasses thought entirely and goes straight to the part of you that simply understands things, that this was where she was supposed to be. She had learned not to argue with that feeling. It had steered her correctly enough times over 44 years that she had made a kind of quiet agreement with it. When it spoke clearly, she moved, so she stayed. She settled into the empty seat beside Vivian, and she did not immediately start talking, which was the first thing that seemed to surprise the young woman, whose body had braced slightly when Claudette sat down in the way that bodies brace when they are expecting to be, managed or redirected or offered the kind of help that is really just someone else's. Discomfort, looking for a resolution. Claudette did not offer any of that. She simply sat there and let the silence be what it was for a few minutes, which was not empty, but full. The kind of silence that gives a person room to decide for themselves how much they want to open and in which direction. She looked forward rather than at Vivian, which she did deliberately because she had found over the years that people talked more freely when they didn't feel watched, when the person they were talking to gave them the dignity of some sideways space, rather than full direct attention that could feel like pressure dressed up as care. After a few minutes, Vivian reached for a tissue and pressed it against her face and took a breath that came out unsteady at both ends. The kind of breath that has been doing double duty for a while, holding things in and letting things out at the same time. And then she said she was sorry. Claudette turned to look at her then and said, "Don't be." And she said it in a tone that was not dismissive of the apology, but that made clear the apology was entirely unnecessary, that there was nothing happening here that required an apology from anyone. Vivian looked at her with the slightly raw expression of someone who's been crying long enough that their face has stopped trying to hide it. And she said she didn't know what was wrong with her. She was not normally like this. She did not do this. And Claudette said, gently, that she thought Vivian probably knew exactly what was wrong with her, and that sometimes saying we don't know is just a safe way of not yet being ready to say we do. Something moved across Vivian's face at that, a recognition of some kind, the particular look of a person who has just heard a true thing said plainly, and is deciding whether to lean into it or away from it. She leaned in, not immediately. She was quiet for another few minutes, and Claudette stayed right where she was, not filling the space, not nudging, just present in the steady way that certain people are present. The kind of present that communicates, I am not going anywhere, and I am not in a hurry, and whatever you need to do right now is fine with me. When Vivian started talking, it came out slowly at first, in the careful way of someone who is testing the ground before they put their full weight on it. And what she said at the beginning was not the real thing, but it was on the way to the real thing, which was all anyone could ask. She talked about her father. She talked about the phone call from his assistant 3 weeks ago with the calendar invitation for this trip. The bland corporate language of family matter of some importance that had sat in her chest like a stone, ever since, because she knew her father well enough to know that those words, arranged in that order, sent through an assistant rather than picked up the phone himself, meant something significant was coming, and that she would be expected to arrive at it already composed and already steady and already. Whatever version of herself made the conversation easiest for him. She said she and her father had not spoken in 4 months. She said this the way people say things that have a much longer and more complicated story underneath them, with a flatness that is not indifference, but is the sound of something that has been felt so many times it has worn its own groove, and the person has learned to speak across the surface of it without going in. Claudette listened and did not say anything yet, and did not make the small sounds of encouragement that can sometimes feel like pressure to keep performing the story for someone else's benefit. She just listened fully and quietly, and Vivian continued. She talked about what it had been like to grow up as the only child of a man who was more present in newspaper profiles than he was at the dinner table. She talked about it without self-pity, which was something Claudette noticed and respected. The way she framed it not as a complaint, but as a simple description of a geography she had grown up inside of, and had spent her whole adult life trying to find her way around. She said he was not a bad man. She said that clearly, and she meant it. You could tell she meant it. But she said that being a good man and being an available father were two entirely different things, and her father had spent her whole life being very committed to the first and genuinely unable to fully understand what the second required of him. Claudette nodded slowly at that and said that was one of the more honest things she had heard anyone say about a parent in a long time. And Vivian gave a short, soft sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost. And it changed the texture of the air between them in a way that both of them felt. Then Vivian went quiet again, and the almost laugh faded, and something came into her face that was different from what had been there before, heavier and more private. And Claudette felt the conversation shifting the way you feel a room shift when someone is about to say the real thing instead of the things around the real thing. She waited. Vivian looked down at her hands in her lap, and then out at the window where there was nothing to see but dark sky and the faint glow of the wing light blinking its steady, patient rhythm. And then she said that the trip was not just about her father. She said there was something else. She said she had received some news 3 days before this flight, and she had not told anyone. Not one single person in her life, not her closest friend, not the therapist she had been seeing for 2 years, not the one person she had trusted enough in the last year to let properly close. She had told no one because she had not known how to find the beginning of the sentence, had not known which words to put first or how to arrange them in a way that made what she was carrying feel like something that could be shared rather than something that would simply transfer its full weight onto whoever she handed it to, and she had not wanted to do that to anyone she loved. And yet here she was, on a plane over the Atlantic, beginning that sentence for the first time out loud, to a woman whose last name she didn't know, who had walked forward from 4 rows back and crouched down in an aisle and offered nothing except her presence and her willingness to stay. Claudette turned to face her more fully now, because the moment called for it. Because there are times when sideways space is what is needed, and there are times when a person needs you to be fully turned toward them, so they know the weight of what they are about to put down will be properly caught. And this was one of the second kind of times. She looked at Vivian, and she said, "You can say it." Just that. 2 words, no performance in them, no pressure wrapped up inside them, just a simple opening held out like a hand. And Vivian took it. And she said the thing she had been carrying alone for 3 days, over thousands of miles through airports and hotel rooms, and the long sleepless night before she boarded this plane. And when it was out, when the words were finally in the air between them, she pressed her hand over her mouth and closed her eyes. And Claudette reached over without hesitation and covered Vivian's other hand with hers, and held it, firmly and without any awkwardness at all. The way you hold the hand of someone who has just set down something very heavy and needs a moment before they can figure out what to do next. The word came out in pieces, the way words do when they have been locked inside a person for too long and the door finally opens and they don't rush out all at once, but instead emerge slowly, carefully, blinking in the light of being said out loud for the very first time. Vivian said the name of what the doctor had told her, and then she stopped. And then she said it again more steadily, as if the second time was practice for every time she would eventually have to say it to the people who deserved to hear it from her directly. She was sick, not in the vague, uncertain way of someone who had been feeling unwell and was waiting for answers. She had the answers. She had been sitting in a doctor's office 3 days ago, looking at a face she had always trusted and hearing words that rearranged everything she thought she understood about the immediate shape of her future. It was early, the doctor had said. That was the important thing. That was the thing to hold on to. It had been caught early, and that changed everything about what the road ahead looked like. But early did not mean easy, and catching it did not mean the fear disappeared, and Vivian had sat in that office nodding in all the right places and asking the practical questions that her mind had immediately organized itself around, because that was what her mind did under pressure. It went practical, it went logical, it built a structure to stand inside of, because the alternative was to stand in the open with nothing above you, and she was not ready for that. She had shaken her doctor's hand at the end of the appointment, and she had walked through the waiting room and through the glass doors and out into the street. And she had stood on the sidewalk in the middle of a city that was going about its business entirely, without reference to what had just happened inside that building. And she had felt something she could only describe as a complete and total silence inside herself. Not peaceful, not calm, but the specific silence that comes right before a very loud thing, like the second between lightning and thunder when the world is holding its breath without knowing it. She had not cried then. She had gone home and she had sat on her kitchen floor. Not the couch, not the bed, the floor, which was where she had always gone since childhood, when something was too big to process in a place that was designed for comfort. And she had sat there for a long time, and she had still not cried. She had made lists instead. Lists of questions for the follow-up appointment. Lists of things she would need to organize. Lists of people she would eventually need to tell, and in what order and how. And she had written them all down in the small notebook she kept in her bag, and the writing had kept her hands busy and her mind structured, and the tears had stayed exactly where they were, held back by the particular discipline of a woman who had learned very young that composure was not just valued in her world, but expected. That falling apart was something that happened to other people, or happened to you in private, where it couldn't reflect on anything or anyone beyond yourself. She had gotten through 3 days like that, organized and functional and completely sealed. She had packed for this trip and answered emails and had a phone call with her father's assistant about logistics and eaten meals she couldn't remember at a table. She sat it alone because she had kept her social calendar clear all week without telling anyone why. And she had moved through all of it in that strange sealed state that she now understood. Sitting on this plane with Claudette's hand over hers had not been strength at all, but was actually the last thing before the breaking. And the breaking had happened here, on a plane at 30,000 feet, with a stranger from Baltimore who had walked forward from 4 rows back and crouched in an aisle, and said, "I can see you," and refused to look away. Claudette listened to all of it without interrupting once. She listened to the doctor's office, and the sidewalk, and the kitchen floor, and the 3 days of lists, and the sealed and functional composure that had finally given way somewhere over the eastern seaboard. And she did not fill the pauses with reassurances or redirect towards silver linings or do any of the things that people do when they are uncomfortable with someone else's fear, and are trying to manage their own discomfort. Under the cover of being helpful, she just received it. All of it. The way a person receives something they understand to be important, with their full attention, and without flinching. When Vivian finished talking, the cabin was quiet around them, and the plane hummed its steady indifferent hum, and somewhere toward the back a baby was making small sounds that floated forward through the dimness like something from a different world entirely. Claudette was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone searching for the right thing to say, but the silence of someone who already knew and was simply giving the words a moment to settle before she spoke. Then she said that she was glad Vivian had said it out loud. She said it plainly, and she meant it plainly, and there was nothing complicated in it. She said that fear that lives only inside you has a way of expanding to fill every available space, and that the moment you let it out, even just to one person, even just to a stranger on a plane, it stops being the only thing in the room. Vivian looked at her, and her eyes were still wet, but something in her face had changed. Some quality of the tension in it had shifted. And she said she didn't know why she had told her. She had not planned to tell anyone until she got back from London and had a plan in place and knew what she was going to say. Claudette said she thought sometimes the right person appeared at the right moment and the body recognized it before the mind caught up. And that sitting next to someone in pain for 11 hours and saying nothing was just not something she had been built to do. Vivian asked her about herself, then, quietly and genuinely, the way you ask about someone when you have just trusted them with something real and you want to know who you trusted it to. And Claudette talked, not at length, not making it about herself, but enough to give Vivian something true in return, because that was how it was supposed to work between people. That was the exchange that made a conversation feel like a conversation rather than a transaction. She talked about Baltimore and the school and her 3 children and the years of doing it alone after her marriage ended. And she talked about it the way she lived it, without complaint or drama, but with a frankness that made it real. And Vivian listened the way she had not listened to another person in a long time. Not politely or dutifully, but with actual curiosity, actual interest in the specific details of a life that was entirely unlike her own. At some point, one of the flight attendants came by, and Claudette ordered tea, and Vivian ordered the same, and they sat with the cups warm in their hands, and the conversation moved and shifted the way good conversations do, from the heavy to the lighter and back again, from the specific and frightening to the general and almost funny and back. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Vivian said something that stopped them both. She said she had been dreading this trip because she knew she was going to have to tell her father, and she had no idea how he was going to respond, and that the not knowing was almost worse than any of the other things because her father's responses had always been the variable she could not predict in any equation. The one factor that she had spent her whole life trying to calculate and had never quite managed to get right. Claudette set her cup down, and she asked Vivian, gently and without any agenda in it, what she was actually hoping for from him. Not what she expected, what she hoped for. And Vivian opened her mouth to answer, and then closed it again. And then she looked out the window for a long moment, and when she looked back, there was something different in her eyes. Something quieter and more honest than what had been there before. And she said she just wanted him to be her father, not the businessman and not the public figure, and not the man who responded to difficulty by immediately converting it into a problem that needed solving and assigning resources to the solution. She just wanted him to be her father in the way that she had needed him to be her father her whole life and had never quite known how to ask for without it coming out as an accusation rather than a request. Claudette nodded slowly and said that was one of the most important things she had ever heard anyone figure out about themselves. And she said she thought Vivian should tell him exactly that. In exactly those words. No armor and no careful framing. Just that sentence, the way she had just said it. Vivian said she didn't know if she was brave enough for that. And Claudette looked at her steadily and said that a woman who had just said, out loud on a plane to a complete stranger, the thing she had been most afraid to say to anyone was not someone who had a shortage of bravery. She said the bravery was already there. It had been there the whole time. Vivian just needed to point it in the right direction.